Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Mining Stock Daily here on Rackla Metals hit property in Yukon. Just got dropped off by the heli at the top of the hill, and just spectacular, beautiful views of the mountain ranges here in Yukon. We are going to get this long form episode in. Finally, we're getting in author Ernest Scheyder from Reuters and his latest publication called The War Below, where he talks about all different angles of mining as we continue to move down the energy transition and the responsibility of miners in lithium, tungsten, nickel, all those things. We talk about the book, we talk about his reporting, and really a lot about the stories in there. And plus that big picture of really that give and pull, the push and pull of what it's going to take for the miners and communities and governments to continue to move mineral production forward. I'd like to send a special thank you to our ongoing sponsors, Arizona Sonoran Copper, Fireweed Metals, Vista Silver, and yes, Victoria Gold for their continued support of the podcast. And all honesty, my heart goes out to everybody there affected by this week's events. And I think we'll get a little bit more clarity as obviously time moves forward here in the coming weeks. Here is my conversation with Ernest Scheyder. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll be back home from the Denver studio next week for a short week, 4th of July holiday. All right, everybody. Here's Ernest Scheyder. Welcome back into Mining Stock Daily, everybody. There's been a book out on the market here at your local bookstore, anywhere you do get your books, that I think is really a must-read for anybody obviously involved in the mining sector, at all involved in investing and speculating in resources, and maybe just anyone who's not involved in either of those and just interested in how we are actually going to manage to get to this green energy revolution that is really the forefront of a lot of discussion and talking points here the last number of years. I'm happy to welcome in Ernest Scheyder. He's a publisher, the author of a new book called The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. It's a fascinating read. Ernest, welcome to Mining Stock Daily.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Trevor.
Yeah, I'm sorry it's taken so long. We had you on the Power Current podcast with Chris Berry a few months ago. Great conversation. I had the chance to meet you in person in Denver during the book signing, actually. Right, and I got to give you, you came to the tattered cover, and you gave a reading of book, and I was like, oh man, this guy's going to be in for it, because there's room full of like miners and geologists. I think we took it pretty easy on you, though.
It was a great conversation. Obviously, it's a complicated area, and I've just been so thankful that the book is being digested and received by a whole host of folks across industry, whether that's people in the mining industry or people in conservation circles or in investing circles or in policy circles. I've just been grateful for how it's been received in a lot of different spheres.
Yeah. So tell me about, you were on the road marketing this thing for, seemed quite a while. Talk about that road trip and get in front of new people. What was there one, maybe one event that really stood out to you that maybe surprised the heck out of you?
Well, it wasn't really a formal book tour per se, but I've had a chance to go to several different locations across the country. You mentioned Denver. We've shared the book in DC and LA and Berkeley. And I just was in Minnesota a week or two ago sharing the book there. Part of the book is set in Minnesota, so it was a chance to go and say thank you really to the people that helped share their time and expertise with the book. And so going back to an area that I'd spent a lot of time researching and reporting for the book was really gratifying for me as the author to be able to meet with folks that I had profiled and chronicled in the book and in the narrative. So that was really gratifying for me as the author to go and be able to share that with the folks there.
Yeah. Before publishing this book, you currently are still a reporter for Reuters, but before the book, you were covering the fracking boom and natural gas and oil boom. Talk to me about how that really set up this pathway and transition into, green energy metals and mining?
Sure. I mean, the fracking boom, I guess sort of just backing up here. I mean, I joined Reuters about 15 years ago in New York, and the fracking boom took off not long after that, powered by technology, of course, technology that was revolutionizing the way that the United States thought about oil production and natural gas production. And this really started to unlock shale formations in parts of Pennsylvania and Ohio, and I spent a lot of time reporting on that. And then I moved to North Dakota for Reuters. I lost a bet probably, or was on was on a short list or something. I don't know, but it was actually a great opportunity. And North Dakota's economy was completely revolutionized by technology. And that was a huge part of what made America, where we sit here today, the largest oil producer in history. I mean, the United States is pumping more oil than any country anytime in history, and that's all due to technology. And in 2018, I had an opportunity to sort of switch my area of coverage to look at the critical minerals that were beginning to be talked a lot about, especially in electric vehicle circles, but also just in green energy and clean energy circles in general. And that transition, of course, was also powered by technology, a rise in a shift in transportation, and also a rise in electrification for many of these gadgets and gizmos that we use every single day that perhaps we hadn't before. I mean, Trevor, you and I are talking to each other right now in cameras and microphones that were not nearly as pervasive now, maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So these are all built with critical minerals that have to come from somewhere. So there again, you start to see a technology shift powering a change in energy and energy consumption and energy production. And so for me, those are how the two are intrinsically linked here.
Yeah. Okay. Obviously, the fracking industry and its process continues to be still controversial. A lot of opinions about and the science behind it. Is that's no different, obviously, here in mining. But mining has always been somewhat controversial, and maybe even more so. As in the last couple of decades, with the amount of communication media that is easily being transferred to consumers, all about the internet. But in this book, I mean, you went to basically every single controversial mining project location in the United States, from Nevada, Arizona, as you mentioned, Minnesota, and even in South Carolina. Before we kind of dive, I don't want to kind of nitpick and give away the stories here. I want people to read it for themselves. But talk to me about it. It could have been hard to find people from either side of the opinion, right? Like, because everybody's very much opinion. I guess my follow-up question is, how did you manage everybody's opinion and expectations of really the question that you posed to us in Denver is, who defines what responsible mining actually is? Who defines that?
Yeah, I mean, so the reason that I crafted the narrative the way that I did, most of the projects are in the United States, as you mentioned, Trevor, and that was a conscious choice because I wanted U.S. audiences to have to grapple with this idea of choice. What are the choices we're willing to make if we want to go green, and where would we allow mining, where would we not allow mining? And so each story of that focused on a proposed project in the narrative is, yes, certainly about that proposed project, but it does bring one of these questions around choice to the reader. And so there's a story about a proposed lithium mine in Nevada that is at the site of a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet. So this is bringing a question of biodiversity to the reader. What matters more here, biodiversity or the fight against climate change? There's another chapter that's focused on a proposed copper and lithium and cobalt mine in northern Minnesota, which we were referencing earlier. This deposit, though, was right next to the Great Lakes and watersheds that feed the Great Lakes. And so it brings up questions, does water and water preservation matter more than the fight against climate change? And so I've basically focused each chapter on sort of broader themes. So beyond even the issue at stake here, the reader gets a chance to dive into a different piece of the fight here. There's a big question around what matters more in chapter 2, a giant copper supply or Native American religious rights. And these are really sticky areas, and there's no clear-cut answers. But I really wanted the reader to have to grapple with the complexities here because we didn't really have this collective discussion 100, 150 years ago when the petroleum-based economy took off. And we got a lot of things out of that, but climate change certainly was one of them. A lot of armed conflicts related to petroleum, a cartel that controls, roughly a third of the world's oil. And so if we're not having these collective discussions, we're now, as the 21st century economy transitions to a materials-based one, where are we going to land in 50, 60, 70 years? Part of the book, I talk about some concerns that analysts and others have that we could have wars in the future over copper, which sort of sounds crazy when you think about it, but that's
Hmm.
a worry that they put out there, that we could have armed conflicts over this red metal that underpins many electronic devices. So where, how, and why we want to get these building blocks really matters, and we have to be having these discussions.
Yeah. What's fascinating, I mean, a lot of these local groups in opposition, and in the back of your mind, and maybe you did ask this, but a lot of these areas with these projects, those historic economies during those heights were because of mining. Has that just been forgotten, or have people have chosen who are maybe objecting to these projects? Have they just said, well, that was then, our economies are different now, we don't need that to grow our economy? But at the same time, in a lot of those small towns, like I've driven through Superior, Arizona, and I've been in that copper belt, it's hard to see an economy that grows without mining. So are people just quick to forget?
Well, I think it's site dependent, and certainly different topographies and different regions have different approaches to it. Superior in Arizona, which you mentioned, it is part of what's known as the Copper Corridor in Arizona. There's large mines in the relative nearby area operated by Freeport-McMoRan and other large copper companies. So it is part of the ethos there. That part of Arizona does have a strong hiking and backpacking community as well. And the mayor of the town, who you get to meet in the book, she is very focused on having both, having the mine be a powerhouse for the region's economy, but also supporting local economic development that is perhaps not directly related to mining. So things like tourism, etc. And I talked to a lot of local businesses for the book and got their thoughts and feedback in there. And certainly they want the mine to open in this particular area, but they also have a focus on other parts of the economy. In northern Minnesota, I think we keep going back there, but it's just a great reference point here for our conversation, Trevor. It historically and parts of the state still are large mining jurisdictions. There's a part of Minnesota called the Iron Range where a lot of iron ore is produced. The region, though, is slowly moving away from that, or at least parts of the state are slowly moving away from that. And so, yes, you've got this sort of tension or pull that we chronicle in the book between, sort of this past pride around production of mine materials versus a current economy, especially in the northern part of the state that's on the Canadian border, that's very focused on outdoors activity. There's a huge canoe economy there. The region is called the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness Area, and there's no motorized transportation allowed, so you have to obviously canoe your way around this giant waterway, and so that powers a lot of the region's economy. And the concern from some conservationists that you get to meet when reading the book is that the mine could, if developed, basically poison the waterways that are there, because the type of rock that contains this copper and cobalt and nickel is a sulfide ore, and the concern is that when it interacts with water, cause an acid that would obviously be deleterious to the water. Now, I should say that the company that wants to produce this deposit has been very adamant that it feels it can do it so safely, and that's explained in the book as well. But we've got this large economy that's very tourism dependent and outdoor recreationally enthusiast dependent, and many people say that the economy has moved on from its mining past, and so should focus on this sort of outdoors. And that's part of the tension that
Hmm.
we explore in that chapter as well there, that sort of bring to the reader, I mean, can these two things coexist? What would that look like if it does coexist? Um, are there risks worth taking in order to go green, so to speak?
Yeah. I think one of my favorite parts of this book is, for 2 or 3 years during COVID, we were told to, trust the science. The science is telling us this, and the way we should, protect ourselves and our friends and our family, and do all those things. When you think about it, like these companies who are trying to develop these projects are using science and engineering to kind of lay out a pathway of safe and responsible mining. But when it comes down to it, a lot of people are not trusting the science and the engineering and the studies that are point out there to really show that this can be done safely and environmentally friendly. Um, it comes down to just absolutely like just emotion with it, I mean, like when are we supposed to trust the science and when are we not supposed to trust the science? I guess is when it comes down to it, like when we're threatened and just our own personal opinions.
I would say that the topic certainly is extremely complex, and by not having the debate right now, we're sort of in this sort of murky middle, and the policy community is sort of feeling its way through this issue as well here. So I would say that the more that we collectively, we as citizens of the United States, or really citizens of the world, decide what are the standards by which we allow mining, I mean, that helps set the tone for our elected officials, for our policymakers. A great example, Trevor, is the law that's governed mining in the United States. Much of the Western United States, that is, has been around since the 1870s, when Ulysses S. Grant was president. That law has been tweaked a little bit, but by and large, it's still pretty much the same piece of legislation that's out there. And so that's the main regulatory framework on a federal level for mining that's out there. And so that law did not envision electric vehicles, it did not envision cell phones, it did not really envision electricity, and period. And so from a regulatory perspective, there's very little that's changed when it comes to mining in the US West. And so when we talk about, what is the best science, what is the best approach here, we haven't collectively had to grapple with this as Americans. And so I think this is part of what I was trying to do here, certainly with the book, is sort of bring these complexities to the reader and to say, yeah, there's a lot of moving parts. There's science, there's politics, there's policy, there's so many other layers here that are overlapping. And so by not having the collective discussion about where, how, and why we hope to procure the building blocks for this green energy transition, I mean, that's a choice too. That's indecision. And so should we, just let science be the determining factor, or should we say that, another thing should be a determining factor, like religious rights or other reasons that are not necessarily as clear cut all the time? And so there's all of these different layers here that come into play. And right now, the legislation, as I said, has been around since the 19th century. It has not been fully updated yet, at least on the U.S. federal level. So that's part of the issue here as well, that I think we have to be having a broader talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like whenever there's pushback against project, and maybe there's specific issues of projects, that more times than not, the mining or the development company are willing to come to the table and talk about a specific issue and really do whatever it can, provide the resources, the manpower, the studies to mitigate those concerns, whether it be through R&D or just research with the flower Nevada that company had to do that you mentioned in the book. Like they're always out there in the forefront, really trying to prove to themselves and to the communities that they can not have these problems or these concerns that some organizations or individuals believe that they're going to have. But at the same time, it's much easier to be on the other side of the argument saying, no, this is going to go wrong. And just because you published that study and you've devoted, sometimes millions of dollars to proving me wrong, I still don't believe you. And so like, doesn't the other side need to be a little bit more understanding and be able to come to the table as well?
Well, one of the things that I was at pains to do in the book is to not really share my opinion on a lot of these complex projects. had the great benefit and privilege of speaking with folks on all sides of these issues, whether for or against, or perhaps in another facet approaching specific projects. And I wanted my opinion to sort of reseed and to help the reader sort of wade through these issues by seeing these people and seeing what makes them tick, and really humanize all of these issues. Because you're right. I mean, to your point, I mean, some people could perceive what a conservationist does as just total intransigence, and some people could look at what a mining company does as just sheer aggressiveness. And those are people's perspectives in some areas. But there are a lot of different perspectives on these issues. And I think by not having the collective discussion around, like, hey, like, what is the adequate level of science, for instance, that we would accept for a particular project, and what does that look like to have a study developed that would help understand how a project could affect either a region or a particular plant or animal in that region. I think these are all necessary parts of the conversation around it. And by not having the collective discussion, I think we leave our policymakers and politicians sort of unclear about what the broader populace wants to do. And so I think these are all part of what we need to be demanding of our elected officials here. And so my privilege in writing The War Below really was to bring these complex areas to the reader and say, like, okay, hey, we need to be discussing and having the collective discussion about, okay, are there some places that are too special to mine? And if we allow it here, how do we move forward? And what are the to your point, Trevor, what are the scientific standards by which we would allow mining? One of the chapters in the book, I talk about mining certification schemes, which sounds sort of kind of boring and basic, but I wanted the reader to get the backstory of one effort to try to make best standards for a mine. And there are several mining certification programs out there, but the one I profiled in the book particularly is called IRMA, or the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And this was co-founded in part by Tiffany, which is the jewelry company that's iconic and known for its light blue boxes. People buy engagement rings all their time there and other pieces of jewelry. But what Tiffany is not, is it's not a mining company. And so about 20 years ago, the then CEO of the company got together with an NGO and helped create IRMA with the idea of creating what are the best standards for a mine. And from the beginning, IRMA's goals were to get scientists in the same room with policymakers, with unions, with mining companies, with investors, with indigenous groups and others, and basically form standards for mining. And Trevor, I gotta tell you, if it sounds like these groups would be at each other's throats, I mean, that was kind of my perception from the very beginning. But the more I reported this out and chronicled the history of this organization, I learned that they actually came to an agreement on mining standards. It took them more than a decade, but they got there. And this is part of tracking the best standards that IRMA thinks are the ways to operate a mine, including the scientific standards for safety. And where we sit here today is that mines that are audited by IRMA, the broader public, including me and you, can go on IRMA's website and find standards for how that mine was audited against IRMA standards. So Albemarle, for instance, world's largest lithium company, you can go on IRMA's website right now and pull up the full audit report for how how Albemarle ranks against IRMA standards. And so these are the standards that IRMA says is the best science for operating a lithium facility in this example. And you can sort of see how that stacks up. And so that's not only good for me and you as everyday consumers, but imagine you're like a large automaker that you're buying a lot of lithium from that company. You want to have transparency around the production standards, because if the big promise of the green energy transition is that we're making the planet better than the one that we found, well, people are going to want to know that, hey, okay, cool, like, if I buy an electric vehicle that has no emissions, that's great, but I want to know that that lithium was produced ethically, that the people working at that facility are paid a living wage, that there's not these massive emissions at the facility, that the facility does not use gargantuan amounts of water, and all these other factors that could potentially impact how people think through the production of those critical minerals. And so that is one way that this organization here is trying to help answer some of the tougher questions around where, how, and why we get these building blocks to go green.
Is that just for U.S. mines, or is that IRMA standards worldwide?
It's worldwide. And
Okay.
interestingly, we've got some companies, some manufacturers say they're only going to buy they're only going to buy metals from IRMA audited mines. Now, there's not a giant mass of those yet, so it's more of an aspiration than a hard and fast goal right now. But companies like BMW and Volkswagen are huge supporters of IRMA and want to see this move forward.
Yeah, it all makes sense, but doesn't it, the supply chain, when it goes from mine to processing, smelting and processing, refinement, how difficult is it for those OEMs to track and follow and make sure that they are getting what they signed up to get?
There are interesting efforts to use blockchain and other technologies to trace right from a mine to, say, a cathode or an anode, and they're sort of all over the map, and that is part of it. Part of the goal of IRMA and other organizations is to say, focusing more on site-specific issues rather than sort of mineral traceability. There are organizations out there that do mineral traceability, but if rising tide lifts all boats, the general thrust of IRMA and other certification schemes is like trying to encourage higher standards across the board.
Yeah, and the next question I'm going to ask, I don't want it to sound like I'm against this, like, by any means, but it does sound inflationary to a point. It sounds like it's going to cost more to produce the metal, and when the end consumer is already bootstrapped, with rising costs for the last 3 or 4 years, it's hard to fathom that we would be expected to pay even more for these things because of a kind of NGO type of standards that people are trying to hold themselves to. Is that a serious concern?
Well, when I get asked this question, I remind people about the coffee movement, for instance. It was about 10 or 15 years ago that the fair trade coffee movement really had a strong momentum underneath it. And this was a big push to give farmers, coffee farmers in Ethiopia and parts of Central America, et cetera, make sure that they are paid a living wage, make sure that they use sustainable practices, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'll grant you that coffee is not the same as buying, tons and tons of nickel. But they sort of have the same end goal in mind, is that if a consumer is going to buy a product, the consumer wants to know that that product was made ethically and responsibly. And I think, for instance, the extreme example that comes up a lot in cobalt mining is that in some parts of the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Africa, there can be children as young as 6 or 7 that produce cobalt, and it can often be really, really hard to trace whether or not the cobalt that a small child might mine out of the ground makes its way through the global supply chain into an electronic that you'd buy at a local store. And so the the hope or the push here by industry is that to have sort of rising standards for this, that you would have rising standards across the board here, but nobody wants to buy necessarily a product that was produced with lower than acceptable standards. And so is there a higher cost for that? I suppose in some cases there can be, but there again, this is part of the discussion I think that we should be having. And I think coffee is one, clothing is another. It was about 5 or 10 years ago that there was a giant fire at a garment production facility in Bangladesh, and people were shocked to learn that a lot of the clothes that they buy are from the very, very popular brands that they buy were made by people and working in atrocious conditions, and ended up, unfortunately, some of who ended up dying. And so you're starting to slowly see changes in the apparel industry there as well. And so I think, in general, people are willing to pay more knowing that there are higher standards for production processes. Will it be across the board? I mean, I think we'll see how things play out here in the coming years. But I do argue in the book that it should be part of the conversation around where, how, and why we want to get these building blocks for going green.
Yeah. I assume you got pushback from all different sides. Like, did you get pushback from the mining community that said, "Oh, you weren't, supportive enough of the industry"? And did you also get pushback from, say, the opposition that says you didn't hold the miners more accountable?
Well, I set out from the beginning to sort of paint as best I could a pretty honest and neutral picture of the issues at play here, and I think I hit that mark. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of different communities in the conservation circle, and the investment circle, and the policy circle, and the industry circles around the book. And it really strives to shoot right down the middle and to
Hmm.
explain the complexities of this and to humanize all sides of it. So I'm really at pains, I mean, a great example is there's a gentleman that advocates for a deindustrialization of our global economy as the best way to fight climate change. That is to say, get rid of electricity, we should grow our own food, we should fish, we should procure natural medicines from the forest, etc. And we can talk about whether he's right or wrong, or whether we agree or disagree with him. But the reality is that this is not necessarily as fringe as it once was, and is getting attention out there. And I had an opportunity to actually go out to this proposed lithium mine site and actually camp out with him for the book for a day or two and see this site through his eyes and talk to him about his opposition to this proposed lithium mine. And so I wanted to humanize him, and I did for all the people that graciously shared their time with me for the book. But it was important for me to bring his perspectives and this one small part of the book to the reader, so that she or he can fully think through, okay, where do they actually fall on these issues? And
Hmm.
so I was thankful for his time, as well as everyone else who shared their time here for what is really sort of a complex area. But at the end of the day, we're all people, and human beings are at the center of all these issues. And so really helping to paint a picture of what makes every person tick is what I wanted to aim for the book.
Yeah, listen, I agree with you. I think you approached this book and wrote it from an even keel. I think you did a great job. It has to be very difficult to do, but like people who hold themselves true to journalistic standards get it, and I think you did a great job with it, and on a topic that's often very controversial. Um,
But I will
what's
say, Trevor, I just want to say, like, I do make an opinion. I do have an opinion in the book, and my main opinion here, and I take the reader by the shoulders and really, shake the reader's heart here, is that we have to be having the discussion around this energy transition and where we want to get the building blocks. So that's the core argument that I'm making here, is you can't just put your head in the sand anymore, and we have to be having this debate. And so it's not like that the book is devoid of opinion. My
Mhm.
strong belief and opinion here in writing this book is that we can't just sort of be ignoring this key question. I mean, what are the choices that we're willing to make? And indecision is a choice, whether or not we want to admit it or not. And so that's the main argument or message that I'm bringing here to the reader.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and unfortunately, you also did a good job of pinpointing about the words and promises made on campaign trails that don't come into fruition once those elections are done. And here we are in another election year, Ernie. I know, I'm pretty sure. Just really don't. It's already getting frustrating, but as a voter myself, but these projects are almost used for winning votes, and then when the election's over, those promises aren't made. I mean, is there anything that you're seeing on this election front from either side that you're just seeing more of the same promises being made that maybe were made 4 years ago that just haven't been coming true?
Well, one thing that we definitely have noticed is that some of the proposed projects that I read about in the book that were hotly debated during the 2020 election are still very much in stasis. And so, will the 2024 election finally bring resolution to these projects? I mean, we'll see as after November, I think. But I think where we stand right now is that mining is certainly a very controversial area, and certainly one that it's fair to say, I think, does divide parts of the U.S. electorate, as well as the electorate in other countries across the world. And so, yeah, I mean, it likely will be a key talking point during this election season. It was certainly during 2020.
Yeah. And even after this, when was the book published? It was published in February,
End of January, so
end of
almost beginning of
January.
February. Yeah,
All right.
very
I
end of
mean,
January.
I mean, given with all the recent news, you're almost out, due for an update here, a new version.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, that's why I said I wrote it in a way that each proposed project that I used is sort of indicative of a broader theme. And so no matter what happens, in court cases or who wins the 2024 election or whatnot. I mean, the book is written in a way to holistically talk about these themes that sort of eclipses even the specific issues of those minds. Because I really want the themes in there to sort of be things that we're digesting, regardless of how a judge or a jury may rule in the coming months on a specific project.
Yeah. I found myself when I was reading the book, I found myself, from the mining community's point of view, I think the thing that surprised me the most is like, as you mentioned before, like personalizing some of the stories from the other side. Because that's something we as an industry maybe don't do. We just read the news headlines that an NGO is, pushing back or suing the BLM for an environmental permit. And we don't really understand who the specific individuals are, or, kind of their positions or something like that. And so I think you did a good job of personalizing those stories. So so when people were asking me, well, tell me about the book, and I said, well, from a mining's point of view, I don't think you learn much about certain projects. These are all stories we already know and kind of engraved in our head and have been just,
Well, not the average reader. I think folks like
not the
me
average reader
that
yeah
are
yeah
enmeshed in this world, know the difference between carbonate or hydroxide, or source rock versus other geological terms. But the average, the euphemism I love to give is your Aunt Edna in Iowa. Like, if you're at Thanksgiving dinner with her, would she sort of understand the nuance here? And I don't think the average person does. And so I really wanted to bring this to the average reader. A small anecdote is the guy that read the book, the audio version, which is available now as well. This is a professional audio reader. It does an amazing job. A guy named Matt Godfrey. He said that as he was reading it last fall during Thanksgiving dinner, it brought up a huge point of conversation with his dad at Thanksgiving dinner, his dad was involved in the mining industry and he is not, and didn't know that much about mining. And so he said it sparked a huge conversation at their Thanksgiving table about mining, which was, from my perspective, great to hear, because you had a group of people, some of whom were maybe involved in mining, some of whom knew nothing about mining, and were able to talk about it thanks to the war below, which sparked a conversation, which is one of the main goals in me writing it.
Did you feel like riding off into the sunset knowing your job was complete, Ernie?
I was, I was glad that I was able to bring father and son together over the topic of mining.
That's right.
What a rewarding.
Sometimes I get to do. Sometimes I get to do that with my 9-year-old son as well. We get to talk about mining.
There you go.
It's probably not so much controversial at my dinner table, but let's kind of fast forward here. The book was published in late January, and so some of these stories that you wrote about have continued to progress, move forward, evolve. And I do want to ask you about one of those stories specifically, and kind of go to my next question. On the back of Perpetuate Resources and the Stibnite project in Idaho, I'm old enough to remember that was predominantly a gold mine, but now it's definitely being labeled both, if not more, of an antimony mine. And they have received a number of grants and development capital from the Department of Defense in the U.S. The federal government has been funding this project quite a bit. Obviously, they have interest in it because of the criticality of antimony for our own supply chains. And so we can kind of watch this move forward in real time. But my question here is really on the back of the role of federal government and being kind of the backstop for these projects and deciding, who wins and who doesn't win as far as their projects and where they want to put the capital. And can the federal government be more of does it need to be more of the funding mechanism when the public markets have been very void of resource investment?
So the reason that I wanted to include Perpetua's project in the book is because it's a brownfield site. Brownfield basically means it used to be a mine, or the term means it used to be a mine, or it still is a mine, and it's expanding further. So this is a site that was very active during World War II to produce antimony and other minerals for the war efforts. And antimony can be used as a hardening agent for bullets. You can also use it to create a coat for That's basically a fire retardant. So you think about on the surface, a coating for like the surface of ships and whatnot. So obviously has huge military benefits there. But the site went through a series of owners after World War II, shut down, had some strong environmental concerns, but the deposit is still there, and it contains, as you say, Trevor, a lot of gold and antimony. And so we chronicle earlier in the book proposed greenfield or new mines that are facing various levels of opposition. And what I wanted to do is sort of explore with the reader is, okay, like what would it look like to reopen a mine that has a legacy of mining, that has some infrastructure in place, and what could and would that look like? And so this is a project where you have one company controlled by John Paulson, a famous gold financier, and this company moves its headquarters to Idaho, where this deposit is, and basically has started this process of trying to get access to this deposit and also to produce able to do this without having to basically bear any of the past environmental litigation risks, I guess is the best term,
Mm-hmm.
and for which it was not responsible. And so you get to chronicle sort of this journey during this chapter there. Part of the chapter is that the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon, does help fund part of this company's permitting process because the Pentagon, for reasons we just discussed, obviously wants more antimony produced in the United States. I mean, right now, China is the world's largest producer of antimony, and it has been for a very, very long time, including during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why this mine was opened initially to begin with. And so you do have an example here in this chapter of one part of the U.S. federal government supporting an extractive project, whereas another part might be not as enthusiastic or taking a different approach. And so because this part of this is on federal land, it's going to need to go through the federal NEPA process, and that's basically slowed down the review here. And so it seems like you've got one arm of the federal government not acting in concert with another part of the federal government. And so I wanted to bring that to the reader to help the reader sort of explore the complexities here. And we were talking earlier, Trevor, about the 1872 mining law. I mean, that's just sort of one part of the equation here. But I heard time and time again when I was reporting out the book, when I was reporting out The War Below, that people, either in industry or even in conservation circles, were saying, hey, like this U.S. permit review process is just wildly complex. It's not clear at all how to get a mine. And it's certainly not clear for a brand new mine. But what's sort of interesting to me is that it's not clear here for what's going to be a mine at a site that already had been mined. And so, if we're going to mine anywhere, I mean, would it make sense to mine certainly where there's a mine already in operation? And the company here, shrewdly, and I explore this in the book, does market it heavily as an antimony project now, even though the primary metal that would be produced would be gold. But that definitely was a way to tie this project to the green energy transition.
Yeah. I know the entire state of Idaho is watching this very, very closely because if Stibnite makes it through that NEPA process and gets the green light, I mean, it really could open up the book for a lot of projects in Idaho with many different metals.
Yes.
Idaho has been very fascinating to watch, at least from the investment standpoint. I've put some of my own capital in Idaho, but I mean, it's really endowed with, not only obviously gold and antimony, but there's a couple of very interesting copper deposits that have been opened up with the recent discoveries being made. Obviously, cobalt is can also be mined there. The question is the economics of mining cobalt still, but I mean, it can be. This really got a lot of things going for it that could kind of be the next Nevada of great exploration, right? And we're just waiting on this. We're waiting to see what happens with Stibnite as well.
Yes,
So,
yeah, we'll see where it goes.
yeah, absolutely. So in the last 6 months here, since the book was published and you put your last ink down, what's one of the stories that maybe didn't make it into the book or should have made it into the book if you had another if you had another 6 months, is there another story that would have made it into the book that we've seen this spring?
Well, it was, as you say, this is a fast-moving topic, and so what I wanted each chapter to sort of be thematic rather than sort of specific about that project. And so in that regard, I'm glad that I sort of hit that mark. The broader themes around where, how, and why we get these building blocks, I think, the book brings that well to the reader and helps the reader explore those things. I mean, there's other proposed projects that didn't end up in the draft for various reasons. But I still think broadly, with a broad brushstroke, we paint or the book paints this picture of the complexities of this space. But I mean, there's always more you can put in there, right? It's hard as a writer sometimes to say, okay, where do I put my pen down, and where do I not put my pen down. I mean, I mean, there's always things that you wish you could have included or not have included. But I think broadly, the way that I approach these themes in the book helps the reader get an understanding of the complexities of this space, and really, so hopefully get some creative juices flowing around what people think should be done.
I would assume you're expecting this beat to get very, very popular here as we approach the fall into the election and into the new year.
Well, I mean, it's an area that I'm very fascinated by and focused on, and so it's going to be, I hope, a big topic of conversation amongst the two leading U.S. presidential candidates and internationally as well. And we're starting to see some interesting international activity and how different governments are reacting to this instance. A great example is over the weekend we saw that the Serbian government might move forward on its Rio Tinto lithium project there that had been receiving a lot of opposition in the past year or two from local people. But you've got the government saying, hey, perhaps we need to move this forward. And of course, there are many interesting layers there, but geopolitics certainly is one of them, because Europe does not produce a lot of lithium right now, and is hugely reliant on China and elsewhere in the world. So by producing more of its own lithium regionally, that would help decrease the continent's dependence on other parts of the world for this key building block. And that's just sort of one example there that you've got a politician sort of removing part of a logjam for a project.
Yeah. So is your beat getting your beat's getting larger? Are you following more of the international markets as well?
Yeah, so I'm part of a team here at Reuters that looks at mining from an international perspective, and we all
Yeah.
work collaboratively and collectively together to look at a lot of these issues. And it means many of these issues are not just specific to one country, certainly. I think what has been interesting to follow the past 10 or 15 years is that well, I should say maybe perhaps more in the past 5 or 10 years, is that globalization, while not particularly over, perhaps is shifting a little bit to be focused more on regionalization. And I think the pandemic had a little bit to do with that as folks began to think through these really long supply chains that were the conduits for many of the building blocks of our everyday lives. And I guess a great example, Trevor, would be, during the pandemic, it was roughly 4.5 years ago, we all discovered that most of the masks in the world were not made in the United States. They were made in Eastern Asia, and people were sort of just shocked. This most basic yet essential piece of medical equipment was not made in the United States. Now you just sort of extrapolate that for all the other electronics that are out there, and I think it really helps to crystallize for people the extremely long supply chains that can be disrupted by weather, by conflict, by another factor. And so you're starting to see regionalization crop up. And I think especially when it comes to the energy transition, I mean, if the energy transition's promise is anything, it's that we're going to help reduce global emissions. But if you're taking lithium, for instance, out of the ground in northern Chile, which is one of the biggest production regions in the world, and then shipping it to the Chilean coast, and then having it go across the Pacific Ocean to a cathode facility in East Asia, and put into a battery, and then shipped back across the Pacific Ocean to the US, where it's put into a consumer device or an electric vehicle. I mean, that's twice across the Pacific Ocean. That's a lot of emissions. So would it make more sense to have a more regional production of that critical mineral? I mean, we're starting to see that trend gradually emerge. That's bringing with it a whole host of new questions and complexities. But I think that's part of what we have to be grappling with here as well. And we're not right now, but I hope the war below is part of these broader conversations.
Is there a broader conversation happening on the refinement side of things? After
Sure.
out of mine into metals refinement in the U.S. Are there people that is there an appetite to kind of reestablish that in the U.S. and in the West?
So there's definitely, well, yes, after you take a rock out of the ground, it obviously can't just go right into your electric car. You got to do something to it. And
Right.
there's many, many, many steps that have to happen in the interim there. Yes, we are starting to see more conversations happen. I mean, me and a colleague here at Reuters about a week or two ago reported out, we had a scoop that the Asarco, a Hayden smelter in Arizona, which had been owned by this company Asarco, is on the drawing board to be restarted. This had been mothballed, and copper smelters, there's only two of them in the United States right now. So this would sort of increase that capacity to three in the country. That would still dwarf the number in China, which is more than 20 or 25, I believe, and growing. But in order to actually have the benefits of more copper mining, you have to have more copper smelting and other processing capabilities. So that's just one example right there that the copper industry is responding to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I drove past that Hayden smelter 2 months ago, actually.
Okay.
So, yeah, I know exactly. Can visit in the back of my head. I actually was wondering, do people actually live there? And I guess people do still live there. So, yeah. All right. The book's called The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. In my opinion, it is a must-read for anybody involved in the mining sector. Ernest Scheyder, author and columnist for Reuters. Thanks so much for your time. Congratulations on the book, and I'm pretty sure it's doing really, really well. I go to conferences and I keep referencing it, and somebody says, "Yeah, I've read that book," or "I'm reading that book right now." So, yeah, well done. Thank you so much for your time.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Trevor. Thanks for your time and have a great day.
You too.